Welcome to today's episode of Origins. Crash Bandicoot raced its way onto our screens back in 1996, kickstarting a never-ending whirlwind of computer-generated chaos that's still thriving today. Unlike some other titles at the time, the wonderful world of Crash wasn't created by novices. By the time the game saw the light of day, Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin had been toiling away in the industry for nigh on a decade, even moonlighting as game designers when they were still in high school. They were experienced pros in an industry that was hungry for more, and they knew how to feed the beast. So let's dive into a story of how a simple Australian Bandicoot became a genetically modified cartoon masterpiece, and one of PlayStation's most prized titles. Video game fans are used to seeing new and elaborate characters spring up out of nowhere, but it's not very often that icons are made. Crash Bandicoot may have been cooked up in Dr. Neo-Cortex's lab, but the real story behind this blue jean-wearing marsupial is much more intriguing. First, let's look at the men behind the monster. Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin first crossed paths at the tender age of 12, while both attending Langley High School in Northern Virginia's Fairfax County in the 80s. They immediately bonded over their shared love of games, but it wasn't merely a normal teen fascination with who could get the highest score on Pac-Man. During their high school years, this dynamic duo began to dive deeper into territory that most casual gamers don't, dabbling with general-purpose programming languages like Lisp and C++. They soon realized that simply playing with other people's creations wasn't enough. They wanted to make something for themselves. In 1984, Jam Software was born, turning what was once a passion project into a legitimate business venture. The next couple of years moved quickly for the high school savants. By 1989, they'd sold games to Bodeville and Electronic Arts. Math Jam came first in 1985, followed by Keith the Thief 4 years later. The latter was snapped up by EA after the teenage creators cold-called the company and happened to get through to a producer. It was a bold move that served them well, even though the reviews for the game were shockingly bad. Although Jam was a worthy business, both Gavin and Rubin continued to study, with Gavin gaining a degree in neurobiological science from Haverford College, while Rubin attended the University of Michigan. As they were concentrating on their education, the gaming industry was accelerating. The 90s brought with it a wave of new, interesting titles, as well as the opportunity to work with developing software like the 3DO. Sensing the need to start fresh to enter into a new phase of business, Jam Software was rebranded to Naughty Dog. By this point, Rubin and Gavin had come further than many companies, but their financial standing was far from secure. Although they had managed to sell another title, Rings of Power, to EA, it wasn't an overly lucrative deal, and that game wasn't exactly bowling critics over either. Despite having plenty more ideas left to peddle, there was so little money in the kitty that Naughty Dog was technically bankrupt. The dynamic duo decided to take one last risk, pooling what little money they had left into making another title for EA, this time a fighting game called Way of the Warrior. Video games typically cost a small fortune to produce, but Naughty Dog had just $80,000 left to throw at the project. If it failed, it would mean not just the end of business, but also have some harrowing financial repercussions. In many ways, Way of the Warrior was Naughty Dog's last hope. If it could be finished and sold, the company wouldn't go under, but despite their efforts, at one point, it looked like the Mortal Kombat-inspired title would never be finished due to the severe lack of funding. As such, Rubin and Gavin pulled out all of the stops to complete it, even asking friends to step in to portray the characters. There was no money for a legitimate stage or visual effects, so it was shot in Andy and Jason's apartment, with a yellow sheet stuck to the wall in place of a green screen. The creation of the project was so chaotic that neighbors in the apartment building assumed that some sort of adult film was being made. If only they knew what they were actually watching, the makings of pop culture history. By some miracle, Naughty Dog managed to complete the project, and Way of the Warrior hit the shelves in 1994. Although it wasn't a game changer for the video game market, it did catch the attention of one major player, Universal Studios. Sales may not have been out of this world, but Way of the Warrior did end up presenting a huge opportunity for a tiny company. It didn't stop there. Universal was so impressed by Naughty Dog that executives offered the two-man band a housekeeping deal. Andy and Jason had gone from staring down the bleak barrel of bankruptcy to having the opportunity to take Naughty Dog to the next level, and they didn't even have to defeat a boss to do it. Rubin was studying for a PhD at MIT, but he quickly realized there was no more time to waste. He was at a crossroads: continue pursuing his education and go down a secure route, or give it up and see if he would sink or swim in the world of full-time game development. Rubin realized that opportunity doesn't come knocking all that often, so he said goodbye to the hallowed halls of one of America's most prestigious colleges, and Naughty Dog headed to Hollywood. Little did Rubin and Gavin know that something monumental would happen before they even stepped foot in the City of Angels, a revelation which would be sparked by Sonic's rear end. Way of the Warrior provided the salvation that Naughty Dog needed to fight another day, but Rubin and Gavin were desperate for their next game to exceed mediocre 3-star reviews. The early 90s was an exciting time for gaming, so figuring out the company's next step was no easy task. 3D rendering was fast on the rise, ushering in a new era in development that was still uncharted territory for some consoles. At the time, characters like Donkey Kong, Super Mario, and Sonic the Hedgehog were the undisputed kings of the gaming world, but out of these, only 1994's Donkey Kong Country had forayed into 3D rendering. It also did remarkably well, selling 8.5 million units and becoming the best-selling game of the year, giving Nintendo's SNES console a very welcome boost. After months of talks, brainstorming, and exploring potential gaps in the market, an idea came to Andy and Jason in the unlikeliest of places. The long journey to Los Angeles to take up residence at Universal provided the perfect, if not slightly stinky, setting for a true eureka moment. Rubin later explained, on the second day of the drive, passing Chicago and traveling through America's long flat heartland, fed on McDonald's and accompanied by a gassy Labrador Ridgeback mix, also fed on McDonald's, the idea came to us. We called it the Sonic's Ass Game. But what exactly does that mean? How can something as wild and off the wall as Crash Bandicoot come from a hedgehog's behind? It all boils down to this. Andy and Jason were keen to explore 3D rendering and see how they could exploit this incredibly exciting new era within Naughty Dog, but they wanted to mix it with the character platform action game. The discussion on that long drive soon turned to exactly how this game would look, so they took a well-loved character, Sonic, and began to think about how the gaming experience would be from a player's perspective. Rubin said, "It was born from the question, what would a 3D CAG be like? Well, we thought you'd spend a lot of time looking at Sonic's arse." This concept allowed them to theorize about the pros and cons of a game that was played from this perspective. A million questions were thrown up. Would players be able to connect with a character they only saw from behind? Would it work? Would it be overwhelming? Or, even worse, underwhelming? With this in mind, Naughty Dog continued its journey to Los Angeles, fueled on Big Macs and the excitement of a potentially game-changing idea. After being called up to the big leagues by Universal Games, Gavin, Rubin, and their fledgling studio were brainstorming ideas to make the most out of this life-changing opportunity. As we've seen time and time again, pitching ideas to companies as huge as Universal can be a daunting task. Many developers have to fight tooth and nail to get an idea passed aboard. In some cases, it can take years before a concept eventually gets the green light. Luckily, Andy and Jason immediately clicked with Universal's VP Mark Cerny. When they pitched in the idea of their game, Cerny immediately bought into the concept. After all, this was the man who'd worked on Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog 2 just 2 years prior. Cerny proved to be a worthy ally for Naughty Dog, not just because of his status at Universal, but because he was cut from the same cloth as Rubin and Gavin. Like them, he'd been passionately working on games since his teens, releasing his first title, Marble Madness, at the tender age of 18. This common ground meant that Cerny became an integral part of the development process for the game still referred to as Sonic's Ass. Just before they upped sticks and left for Los Angeles, Naughty Dog had hired a very talented programmer, Dave Baggett. This awesome foursome became the core creative team, but there were still numerous questions that needed to be answered. Like, what console would this exciting new 3D character action game be released on? Would Sega snap it up? What would the final product look like? The idea of something new, exciting, and character-driven that audiences had yet to see was tempting. But there was one prominent issue with going with a company like Sega or Nintendo. These consoles already had mascots, so introducing a new character would mean venturing onto very uncertain ground, with a lot of in-house competition. But there was one other option, the upcoming Sony PlayStation. It was bold, it was attractive, and most importantly, it didn't have a mascot. For Naughty Dog, the idea of gambling on a new name in the business was the most viable option for a number of reasons. Not only was it a contemporary move, but Gavin and Rubin's decision also had an element of self-preservation to it. Teaming up with a big name would mean going toe-to-toe with already canonical icons like Sega's Sonic or Nintendo's Super Mario. Going to Sony afforded them the chance to create something new and exciting, allowing them the space to create a character that could be on par with these legends as an OG, instead of as a younger brother. While this would still be an underdog story, it would be on their terms. Even though it was a new system that they hadn't worked with before, Naughty Dog went pedal to the metal and signed a deal with Sony. With all of the logistics in place, it was finally time to set about actually creating the game they'd always envisioned. And it turned out to be no easy task. Naughty Dog was up for a challenge, but now they were officially in the production stages with Sony, the reality soon set in. Would Gavin and Rubin be able to actually pull this off, or had the dog bitten off more than it could chew? No longer called Sonic's Ass, the project began to gain traction, but there was one thing that Rubin and Gavin still didn't have. They needed a character, and fast. The creative team knew they wanted to give an animal human characteristics, as this was a tried and tested method that had worked before for numerous developers. Eventually, they settled on 3 potential animals: the Wombat, the Bandicoot, and the Potteroo. Amazingly, the Wombat became the first choice, with Rubin and Gavin giving the game the working title of Willy the Wombat. While this was all subject to change, the creative team did have a clear vision for the aesthetic of the game. Not only did they want it to break grounds in the realms of 3D, a feat that other developers had only dabbled in thus far, they also wanted to blur the lines between video game simulation and cartoon animation, bringing the two together to create a completely unique experience. In order to bring this element to fruition, Naughty Dog enlisted the help of 2 Hollywood cartoonists, Charles Zembalus and Joe Pearson. Zembalus and Pearson had previously worked on projects like DuckTales and She-Ra Princess of Power, so they came with plenty of experience. Charles focused on creating several iterations of Willy the Wombat until he eventually started to resemble the Crash we're familiar with today. Interestingly, the idea of the game's main villain, Dr. Neo Cortex, was a far easier process that seemed to naturally come together, while Crash, or Willy as he was so called, took far longer to complete. While the characters themselves were important parts of gameplay, Naughty Dog spent just as much time trying to craft elaborate worlds to back up this cartoon fantasy. Joe Pearson was instrumental in helping to make the vision more concise, but there was a problem. No one had done anything like this before in video games. That could be seen as another selling point for the game. However, it was also a major stumbling block. As such detailed scenery didn't exist in other titles, neither did the engines and tools to create it. Not only did Rubin, Gavin, and the rest of the team have to grapple with developing a game, but they had to develop the software at the same time. What came next was a task of epic proportions, but as Rubin later said, our motto was bite off more than we could chew, then figure out some crazy complicated way to make it work. The idea of creating gameplay that looked as good as popular animated features became a prominent goal for the team. In fact, the development of Crash Bandicoot wasn't just ambitious, it was groundbreaking, and even created a totally new Lisp syntax programming language to code the gameplay. All of this was confined to an overall budget of $1.7 million. While the bare bones of the game were taking shape, there was one element that had yet to be fully tested: gameplay. The team had toiled away at nailing the graphics and building the foundations, but actually creating levels was something else entirely. Rubin and Mark Cerny worked closely together to fine-tune the movements of Willy, making sure that the player would have complete control over the character. all the efforts put into designing the world would be for naught if the protagonist felt clumsy and cumbersome to operate. After all, the aim of the game was to progress through levels and overcome obstacles, so Willy had to be spry on his feet. Considering everything that Naughty Dog had overcome by this point, crafting the levels may sound like the easy part, but it proved to be the biggest problem yet. 3D gameplay was still a new concept to Ruben, Gavin, and their partners. In fact, the first 2 levels turned out to be complete failures, thanks in part to the intricately animated world they'd spent months creating. The team had spent so long concentrating on what the world looked like, adding in Maori motifs and a distinct Indiana Jones-like aesthetic, that they'd forgotten to include one key element: fun. For a start, the overzealous design of the levels actually hindered gameplay, forcing Naughty Dog to take a step back and consider their options. They could push ahead, or they could scrap these 2 test levels entirely and go back to the drawing board. With so much at stake, the developers retreated. This move proved to be a wise one. With renewed focus, Naughty Dog started to incorporate elements in the game that would become signature Crash Bandicoot staples, such as the crates. Not only did the crates add a whole new feel to the game, but they also filled empty gaps on levels to make the entire landscape look more interesting. Then there were the rolling stones, perilous pits, and all manner of fiendish traps designed to stop Willy from completing his goal of defeating his foes and rescuing his girlfriend, Torna. The game was starting to take shape, but almost 2 years into the development process, the biggest battle was yet to come. By mid-1996, Universal had penned a deal with Sony to distribute the game, but it still didn't have an official title. With E3 fast looming and a demo in place, Naughty Dog needed to settle on something that was catchy, or, at the very least, better than Willy the Wombat. Surprisingly, unlike some other steps in the process, the Naughty Dog team had a fairly clear-cut idea of what direction they wanted to take, but there was one boss they had to overcome in order to get their idea approved: the terrifying, nearly impossible to beat Universal Marketing Department. By this point, Gavin and Ruben knew their character was a Bandicoot, but the so-called marketing department had other ideas. Wuzzle the Wombat, or Ozzy the Otzel, were serious suggestions that Universal pushed hard for. But Naughty Dog, being Naughty Dog, weren't about to lie down in defeat, and so Willy the Wombat finally became Crash Bandicoot. E3 was just around the corner, which would set the stage for the grand unveiling of this fancy new 3D rendered game, but the situation wasn't as positive as you might think. Yes, Naughty Dog had broken boundaries by creating this game in partnership with one of the hottest new consoles on the market, but other companies had been toiling away at new titles during this time too. E3 wasn't just going to present Crash Bandicoot to the world, it also introduced Mario 64 on Nintendo's cutting-edge console, focused primarily on 3D gaming. Not only that, but the tension was fast brewing between Naughty Dog and Universal. While Mark Cerny remained an outspoken advocate for the smaller company, Universal Interactive as a whole was trying its best to keep Naughty Dog from getting the pat on the head it deserved as the original creator of Crash. In the build-up to E3, Universal even went so far as to ban Naughty Dog from attending, but that wasn't going to fly with Ruben and Gavin. Jason later recalled the situation as a particularly dark time, saying, "It might have worked if Universal were parents and Naughty Dog was their 6-year-old child, but we were an independent company working under contract. Nobody was going to tell us what we could and couldn't do." According to the creators, Universal even forgot to include Naughty Dog's logo on the press materials for E3, but Ruben had a plan for that. He purposely had flyers made to hand out at E3 in front of the Crash Bandicoot stand that stated, "Naughty Dog, creator and developer of Crash Bandicoot." Considering Naughty Dog's position at that time, it took a great amount of courage to push back against the very well-established titan that was Universal Studios. While it's true that Ruben and Gavin had a wealth of experience between them, Naughty Dog was about as far away from being the alpha male of this pack as you could possibly get. Other less gutsy companies may have done as they were told and bowed under the pressure, but Naughty Dog endured. Ruben, Gavin and the rest of the team could have let Universal take the lead and had the protection of near anonymity if the Bandicoot crashed and burned, but they believed in their product wholeheartedly. As a result, they stuck to their guns and pushed for the company name to be involved, persevering under less than pleasant conditions and looking onward to the release date. It would either make or break Naughty Dog, but this was a ship they were prepared to go down with. Luckily, despite the internal conflict and the ever-pressing issue of Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot finally hit shelves on 9th September 1996. Comparison to Mario 64 was to be expected, given both titles utilized 3D rendering, but both were very different games. As such, Crash Bandicoot managed to find its footing, selling over 6 million units and becoming one of PlayStation's biggest titles. All of the hard work had finally paid off, with critics praising the impressive graphics. One reviewer from Game Revolution put it best when he dubbed it as the new standard for PlayStation action games. Work on a sequel began almost immediately, with Crash Bandicoot Cortex Strikes Back unleashed upon the market a little over a year later, selling 1 million copies in just a few short months in America alone. Crash titles continued to hit shelves at a fast pace, proving that the Orange Whiz had a lasting and very lucrative appeal. However, Naughty Dog's relationship with Universal wouldn't be quite as concrete. In 1999, Naughty Dog would part ways with Crash when Universal Studios was bought by Vivendi. Naughty Dog itself was sold to Sony Computer Entertainment in 2001, and the two of them went on to have a long and fruitful relationship in the gaming industry, forging dozens of brilliant games that are known and loved to this day. Gavin and Ruben's time with their Orange Bandicoot prodigy might have come to an end, but Crash titles continued to thrive. Every single release brought new and exciting aspects, better graphics, and more complex worlds. Universal even decided to take a leaf out of Nintendo's book and introduced racing and party game series. Crash, at least for a while, could do no wrong. New releases dropped every year right up until 2008, when something seemed to falter. It took 2 years for Nitro Kart 2 to hit shelves in 2010, but between 2011 and 2016, it looked like the Bandicoot was done for good, with no hint of any new releases in the works. Thankfully, after many years of waiting, the Insane Trilogy was released in 2017. This release seemed to kickstart the franchise again, unleashing Crash onto a whole new audience of younger gamers, as well as appealing to the already established fanbase. As of 2021, the Bandicoot seems to be on sure footing, but considering his wild evolution over the last 2 decades, there's just no telling where this cheeky marsupial might eventually end up. There's no doubt that Crash came from mixed yet humble beginnings, but the crazed Bandicoot has managed to overcome so much more than Dr. Neo Cortex and his band of minions. Crash has survived in-house shootouts, mergers, and acquisitions, and even a head-to-head battle with Super Mario himself. As for Andy Rubin and Jason Gavin, well, they're living proof. You can't keep a good dog down. Thank you for watching Crash Bandicoot Origins, and we'll see you on the next episode.